And then Jim Rohn says on keeping promise, for every promise, there is a price to pay. And on broken promises, somebody says, Anonymous says, a broken promise is not only a lie, but it's also a breach of trust. And on the power of promises, none other than Niccolo Machiavelli says this. The promise given was a necessity of the past. The word broken is a necessity of the present. It's almost like it's almost like politicians giving. No, you promise and then you don't deliver. The moment you're elected, you don't deliver, kind of a thing. So promises are meant to be broken, kind of an idea. That's not our philosophy, by the way. And Abraham Lincoln said this: we must not promise what we ought not, lest we be called. We be called on to perform what we cannot. So it's about accountability. We must not promise what we ought not, lest we be called on to perform what we cannot. And in our contemporary days, there's a teacher named Breen Brown, and I listen to her a lot. And it says this: promises are the fabric of relationships, binding people in mutual trust and hope for the future. Beautiful. Now, promises are the fabric of relationships, binding people in mutual trust and hope for the future. Promises kept, by the way. And somebody says this: a promise is the heartbeat of a commitment, a rhythm that drives trust forward. Even in a marriage covenant, the promise, the vow is a promise, right? And Simon Sinek, I'm sure you're familiar with him, says the future you're building depends on the promises you make today. So that's about promises from contemporary sources. That's not religious, all right? So when you talk about promises, there's something we've got to keep in mind. The other word is a big word called covenant, because without covenant, there is no promise. The promises as a believer, the thing that flows, the thing from which promises flows is covenant, right? That is the thing from which every promises flows. And in a covenant, and everything flows out of that. It's a relationship. So what is a covenant? I'm sure you're very familiar. We've been taught really well. And if you're part of the 2=1, that is our lesson 1, I suppose, in 2=1, the lesson on covenant. The Hebrew word for covenant, it talks about meat. And when you talk about making a covenant, it's the act of cutting the meat. You know, it says, it's the act of cutting the meat. And that's exactly what it is. Like the symbolic act where Abraham, on the 8th day, they had to circumcise. That's the idea of the making a covenant, right? The Abrahamic covenant. So covenants involve cutting an animal into 2 pieces and passing through them. This act symbolizes a binding agreement with severe consequences for breaking them. So it's a covenant, it's a compact, it's we can use the word contract in a sense, which binds 2 people, equally binds 2 people. So the covenant that has been made with Abraham, of course, we have the covenant with Adam, we have the covenant with Noah, and then you have Abraham and Moses. There's so many covenants God made, right? And then eventually we have the new covenant given to us. But covenant involves, it's an agreement that the 2 parties will not abuse that, will not flow out of that. That's a covenant. And inside that covenant are promises, binding promises that are meant to flow in an agreement. And if any one of those party goes against that, there are consequences, terrible consequences. And covenant, the act of cutting the meat, is exactly the consequence that anyone who violates that would face, right? So in Genesis 15:11, this is the covenant that was made. When the sun had gone down and deep darkness had come, there appeared a smoking brazier. It's like a stove, a flaming torch which passed between the divided pieces of the animals. So this is what Abraham sacrificed, right? And also Jeremiah reference concerning the consequence of breaking this. Jeremiah 34:18. Look at this. The men who have violated my covenant, who have not kept the terms of the solemn pledge which they made before me, when they split the sacrificial calf in half, and then afterwards walked between in its separated pieces, sealing their pledges to me by placing a curse on themselves. Should they violate the covenant, those men I will make like a calf. So the ones who disagree, who violate that covenant, will have to face a consequence.